afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the final session, looking at the issue of AI and data science framed in digital human rights and looking at the intersection between technology, law, and justice. They say that they save the best till last. Obviously, this is a massive topic about protecting people and safeguarding people with that human rights perspective. It was also the best till last because you should have been in the tech room while we were trying to wire up such a huge number of people on the stage. So apologies for being slightly late. So it's my privilege to introduce the panel members to you. We haven't sat in a particular order. So I'll just introduce people in the order on my list because that makes life easier for me. Otherwise, I lose my position. So we've got Silky Carlo, who is director of Big Brother Watch. We've got Parosha Chandran, who is a human rights barrister at One Pump Court. Jennifer Cobbe is a researcher from the University of Cambridge. We've got Nick Dale, who's Superintendent of the West Midlands Police. And Darren Edge is going to be presenting a pre-recorded message. He is Director of Human Rights Technology at Microsoft Research. Then we have Angela Henderson, who is co-founder of the Avery Centre. Also will be giving a pre-recorded message in a particular section of this session. And then we have Hannah Tinmay, who's Director of Supply Chain Technology R&D at DigiNex. And finally, Natasha Zervudaci, who is a Sustainability Specialist of Global Supply Chains, also at DigiNex. And then expertly led and cajoled to get the conversation going. It's going to be absolutely fascinating. We've got Anjali Mazumder, who's AI and Justice and Human Rights Team Lead at the Alan Turing Institute, and Allaine Cerwonka, Director of International, also at the Turing. So we've got a very esteemed panel of people who will be bringing their perspectives on digital human rights, and I'll hand over to you, Allaine. Or Angie.
Hard to keep track with so many of us. Thank you, Edwin. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon session on digital human rights dialogue, looking at the nexus of data, justice, and the law. When you hear the terms AI and human rights or technology and human rights, what comes to mind? So we often hear polarized statements that there's an inescapable risk to breaching human rights, particularly discrimination, data protection and privacy, surveillance, mission creep, freedom of association. And on the other hand, there is an opportunity for addressing human rights issues, and potentially even more so an opportunity for responsible AI innovation that safeguards and respects human rights. So in this 90-minute session, which will go fast, we will explore and reflect on the dynamic tensions and issues at the intersection of human rights and technology, providing a dialogue on the role that technologies can play and the safeguards needed to ensure tech respects and protects human rights when addressing particularly human rights issues that involve marginalized, vulnerable, or minority communities who are often experiencing disproportionate outcomes, harms, inequities in policy and technical interventions. So we aim to explore these issues through an interchange of showcasing very short lightning tech talks that have been pre-recorded on how data and tech is being used to address a human rights issue, and also through the discussion with our panelists here who come from very diverse sectors and roles and perspectives. Human rights barrister, Parosha Chandran, to disruptive technologies for ESG, Natasha, to civil society, such as Big Brother Watch with Silky, to law enforcement with Nick Dale from West Midlands Police, and of course, our researcher here at the intersection of law and technology. So, in this session, we'll aim to draw upon this nexus and to explore how and what opportunities that data and tech is being used and what considerations are needed to ensure that data and tech is developed and deployed in ways that can respect human rights. So, we'd like to begin by asking each of our panelists to just reflect and share their perspectives on how data technology can be used to address human rights, what has been or where do they see the most opportunity, challenges, and risks. And we'd really appreciate the very different and distinct perspectives that you each share. So I might just start going down the aisle here with Jennifer. All right.
Thanks very much, Anjali. As Anjali says, I work in law and technology. I come from a law background, but I work in the computer science department at Cambridge, and I sort of work at that intersection. And partly what I'm interested in is thinking about how law can be a way of helping us use technology to address human rights problems, but also I'm concerned with the way that law can itself be a tool for causing human rights problems. So law can be a great mechanism for helping build trust with people. It can be a great mechanism for providing protections for people in ways that allow their data to be used or allow AI-related interventions to find ways to address maybe the human rights challenges that they happen to be facing. And that might be the case in relation to things like modern slavery or human trafficking, where data protection laws, for example, could be very useful for helping convince people or persuade people or show people that if they give their data up for research or for some kind of investigation, then it's not going to cause them harm in the longer run. But there are also problems with that because, of course, we have issues around enforcement. We have issues around laws that simply do not make sense in the context of particular kinds of human rights issues or particular kinds of data issues. And we have bigger problems about access to justice that I think probably other people might mention. But law can also be a problem in relation to some other areas of human rights concerns around data and AI. So, for example, one of the biggest areas that we see AI having, I think, a fairly significantly negative effect on human rights is in the field of labour and employment, where people are being subject to really horrendous algorithmic management practices. We also see things happening in policing. I know we have some more enlightened police officers here today, but in policing in some places, there have been issues around the way data has been used or the way that AI has been used. And that raises very serious, I think, human rights concerns. And a lot of those things that are a problem are not actually illegal or unlawful. A lot of them are grounded very fairly, very reasonably in law. And I think that is an issue, that often the law provides a space for human rights problems to arise through data and technology that we need to think carefully about closing down. Very often law is framed as something that's a barrier to innovation or something that will get in the way of solving these problems, or in fact, problems in society more generally. But law can absolutely be a tool that helps us address these problems. But we also have to kind of be aware that it can also be a problem itself, and that's something that I think we need to think very carefully about.
Thank you. So I'm Parosha. I'm a human rights barrister and professor at King's College London in modern slavery. And I'm going to throw up a very good example of how technology can help combat trafficking. So it's a story about a young boy who in 2021 was arrested by the police with about 2.5 grams worth of heroin and crack cocaine on his body, and was trying to sell a wrap for 20 quid to an undercover police officer. He had a mobile phone on him. When they asked him about how he came across all of this stash of drugs, he refused to answer any police questions. Now, instead of what the police usually were doing, which is arresting the kids in these county lines cases and prosecuting them, they realized that a different approach was needed, because that's not going to stop human trafficking. That's just going to cut out a foot soldier and give a vacancy for a new one. And so as a direct result of cases that I had brought, which had established what's called the non-punishment protection for victims of trafficking, which is not prosecuting people who commit offences as a direct result of their trafficking, The police decided to follow that principle, and they treated him as a victim and a witness rather than an offender. By investigating his mobile phone and by looking at the messages that were stored on this cheap, crappy Nokia, I think it was one of the earliest ones. This was not a glamorized, drug dealing lifestyle that this kid was living. They were able to piece together his movements, taxis that were being arranged for him, how much stash he had, what his debt was, where he was to go to drop off more goods. And they were able to, for the first time, operate a victimless prosecution, which was to use AI and use all the tech that was always available to the police, but they hadn't been using it. He was terrified, this young kid. He was from a care home. He was completely unprotected. And actually, he had been the one who had actually advertised himself on social media to do drug deals for people. He was recruited by a man who said, yeah, I'll take you on. Be in touch with me through Snapchat, which, as you know, deletes the messages as soon as it's sent. And that's how he was recruited. And he spent his time going from Liverpool to North Wales to Bedfordshire to wherever he was meant to go, taking drugs from one place to another to feed the pockets of very dangerous criminals who he would not give evidence against. Now, thankfully, this very, very different way of approaching the crime of human trafficking was successful. And it led to the convictions and sentencing of 6 people, the 2 main perpetrators getting 15 years and 10 years in prison. What was fascinating is, the first person who had sent him that message saying, yes, I'll take you on. He was a man serving a prison sentence himself. And he had sent that message using a stolen phone that had been smuggled into him in prison in Dorset. At some point, his phone got found by the authorities and was taken away, only to be replaced by another. So there were 2 lines that the police were following. And this is a very good example of how human rights law, the cases that I had brought, which led to the non-punishment principle being established in British law, which was a number of years ago, but I still had a case outstanding in the European Court of Human Rights against England for having prosecuted a cannabis kid for a Vietnamese kid for cannabis cultivation, which I won in 2021 with the unanimous judgment of the European Court of Human Rights. That now suddenly the compass point has changed. It's now clear that AI and tech can be used to break down the criminal trafficking gangs. This was the very first successful prosecution for county lines drug dealing in the UK. And I wanted to share with you an optimistic story before we get into a lot of the problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Parosha. Silky.
Well, I can help with that because I'm the pessimistic voice normally. So I'm from Big Brother Watch. We're a privacy and civil liberties organisation working in the UK. And naturally, working at the intersection of technology and human rights, we do focus on the risks, I'm afraid. And that's really important because there are so many. And I think my starting point for this conversation is to say that I think that the emergence of new technologies is creating, and certainly the way that they're being used, is creating completely novel human rights risks. And we'll also hear about some of the new opportunities as well, but it's really important to be conscious about the human rights risks that are completely new. And so if you think about that from a privacy perspective, what new technologies offer in terms of surveillance and monitoring and data collection is unlike anything in the history of planet Earth. The surveillance laws that we have in the UK allow the security and intelligence agencies to collect and monitor all communications data, to intercept communications of entire nations and populations, even to hack devices at a population level. And if we look at the kind of legislation that's being proposed at the moment in the UK with the Online Safety Bill, and also in the EU with chat control, we're seeing attempts to undermine encryption as well. So again, unlocking millions and billions of communications that can be passively sifted. In the analog world, there was simply no possibility to have a police officer in, having an ear into every conversation, even within the confines of your home, even within your bedroom, even around your dinner table. And that's what we have technologically now. We can have ears and eyes everywhere. And so expectations are changing. When people think about privacy now, I think we're adapting our expectations of privacy, and certainly I would argue that the courts are adapting their interpretation of the right to privacy. Far, far away from what the expectations were pre-mobile phones, pre-internet. Now we have a much lower expectation. And I think the same could be said of freedom of expression as well, because the other development that we have is that with AI and algorithmic content moderation, the expectation is that in audible conversations, speech on the internet, that it should be policed and it should be monitored. And in fact, not only according to the rule of law, but according to a kind of moral code as well, because the content rules that we see go far beyond the rule of law, and people can be censored for saying things that are not just illegal, but that are deemed sort of unwanted in other ways. All of these changing limitations around our right to privacy, our freedom of speech, our freedom of association, increasingly our freedom of thought, I would argue as well. All of these changing expectations are linked in with these opportunities and risks that new technologies pose. And so I just finished this opening statement with one example. It's a really good example there of how using data from phones can be used in prosecutions and in innovative ways. I'm going to pose the flip side to that, which is one of the big campaigns that Big Brother Watch has had in recent years is around what we called digital strip searches, whereby complainants of rape and sexual offences were immediately being asked by police forces to hand over their phones and have all of the contents of their phones downloaded. The reason for that is it was the kind of the institutional sexism, let's be honest, and the expectation that a woman would have to prove her innocence, and prove that she wasn't mad and she wasn't lying, was then being instituted through this technological process. And I'm glad to say that's a fight that I think we've broadly won and that things are changing. But it's an example of how, with these opportunities, there are also really massive risks.
Thank you.
Hi, so yeah, I'm from Diginex, as you mentioned, a sort of disruptive tech company, so coming from a slightly different angle, I feel, from the other panelists. And we work with the private sector to support them in using technology to identify risks of primarily issues around forced labour in global supply chains. So the ILO's most recent estimations of modern slavery risk did find that forced labour in the private sector is one of the sort of biggest drivers of forced labour. And this is particularly the case for migrant workers, who are 3 times more likely to find themselves in situations of forced labour. And the private sector, therefore, has a huge responsibility in their global supply chains to be able to understand and identify sort of where that risk is and be able to bring it to light and therefore, obviously, impact and bring change. And what our tools do, so we basically develop sort of technology with companies to shed light on those issues by engaging directly with potentially impacted migrant workers that are working within global supply chains. So we use various different mechanisms of deploying sort of remote surveys to those workers and collecting data from those different stakeholders. I think, anyone who knows sort of what the private industry, private sector is like and what international supply chains are like, they're incredibly complex. There's a lot of different actors within those, and therefore being able to collect data from those different actors, including workers themselves, and being able to triangulate that data to identify risk is incredibly helpful and has allowed us to be able to sort of shine a light on some of those indicators of forced labour and bring that up to companies' attention, therefore allowing victims and potential victims of forced labour to be able to be remediated. So yeah, that's kind of what we do.
Nick, I feel like the pressure's on.
So I feel that there's lots of people who said things, and I'm going to try and remember what I was going to come back on. But I think for the first point, I think, is when you started your story, that could have gone a completely different way, and I was expecting it to be honest. And I think so. What you're talking about, and a lot of what you were talking about, Silky, is what I would call the operational data. So we've got an extraordinary ability now to gather data on individuals. We can download phones, we can get automatic number plate recognition data to see where your car has gone, so we can track your phone and your car. We can do other stuff, some really kind of intrusive stuff with the right checks and balances into phones as well. So there's a lot that's done there, and I know you mentioned Merseyside and North Wales, and there's lots been doing there to operationally do better with the data to identify networks of individuals, so it's not just the people at the bottom of the network who are targeted. And I think there is definitely something there, not just about the victimisation of those individuals, but there's something about the network where those individuals are working, whether they're victims or not, they're working within, and don't get me wrong, I would argue they are, but they probably won't recognise themselves as a victim themselves a lot of the time, but they're working within a network. And where's the public interest? Where do you as the public want the police to be focusing their efforts as high as possible within those networks? So I think we've got an extraordinary ability not just to analyse the data that we gathered through the course of investigation, but also to analyse the data that we've got, the millions of data points we've got within police data, the crime reports, intelligence logs, to lift out those networks, to be able to analyse them using AI tools and techniques, machine learning, to identify before the young person or the vulnerable person has been arrested, what that network looks like, and target and focus on the people higher up in the hierarchy. And I'm guessing that the more intrusive stuff that you're talking about from a Big Brother Watch perspective, what you would want that to be, if it's deployed at all, you'd want it to be deployed at the offenders who are as high as possible in those hierarchies, to sort of cut the head off the snake of these organised crime groups, if you like. So I think that's the important thing that we can do from policing. I think one of the real dangers of this is we doing that, we still only rely on the data we've got as the police, and with the best will in the world, thankfully we do not store a huge amount of data on our citizens compared to maybe other countries, and the sort of stuff you're talking about, Natasha. So you shine a light on something, sometimes you throw other things into the shade. So there will be people who are talking to, people who are in situations talking to NGOs and other groups, information, intelligence that you've got, which would help us not only see what the problem is, but see where our gaps in intelligence are. So there's a lot to analyse, I would say, on 3 different levels. So we understand the operational data, we understand the networks who are working, and then right at the top of that level, we understand the problem. So if you can imagine, if we analyse the data that we've got between us, between police, NGOs, financial institutions, understand the data that identifies modern slavery networks, people who are being exploited and targeting, we can then identify the problem at a sort of a macro scale, at a national scale. So we can identify how many victims there are, what the typology is, and then you can start to make sure there are the resources to tackle the problem. And that then leads on to the main, well, I'll talk about 2 problems because I'm over time. The first problem here is the sort of turning the stone issue. Once you turn the stone on it, where do you find the resources to deal with it? There's the old estimate of 10 to 13, I think it was, 1,000 victims of modern slavery in the country. There's a couple of estimates been done since then. one that my project was involved in, that said there's about 100,000, another one that said 130,000. So if we say as a country there's 100 to 130,000 victims of modern slavery in the country, what do we, law enforcement, society, other agencies do about that? That's the first problem. The other problem was ethics. Okay, so I genuinely don't want to live in a going back to the Peelian principle. So Robert Peel said the police are the public and the public are the police. We don't want to live in a society where the police have all the data that we could possibly want and can do anything we want with it. So there's got to be some ethical guardrails. We've got to work with civil society to understand not just what we can do with data, but what we should do with data. And I'll stop there because I've gone over time, as ever.
Thank you, Nick. So we're now going to turn our attention to a couple of short tech talks to hear about how tech is being used, or data and tech are being used, to address some of the issues that we've just heard. So hopefully someone will cue them now.
Yes. Hi, my name is Hannah Tignani, and I'm Director of Supply Chain Technology, Research and Development at Diginex. Prior to this role, I led a research team at United Nations University, a research think tank of UN, where I began working on this project Apprise, that here at Diginex we further developed and scaled. So I mentioned both organizations now. So this work started with the realization that our current methods of identifying victims are not adequate. The most recent prevalence estimates of forced labor indicate that 27.6 million people are trapped in these exploitative working conditions. When I compare that to the 53,800 people that the Global Trafficking in Persons report say were identified in 2020, it tells me two things. Firstly, our current methods are failing the biggest proportion of workers in these situations. Only 0.2% of those that were in exploitation were helped in 2020. Secondly, what we know about human trafficking cases represents only the minority of cases that exist. This is important when you think of the move towards evidence-based prioritization of action and evidence-based policy. Our actions are being based on what we know from only 0.2% of the population. Apprise began through a series of consultations with frontline responders. That's the broad term I use to refer to anyone whose job it is to assess working conditions and support workers to seek help in cases of labour exploitation and human trafficking. I situated this work in Thailand and met with just over 30 frontline responders to understand the problems they had in victim identification, their use of technology, and how they thought technology could help them to address these problems. Based on these interviews, and through a 12-month process of iteratively prototyping and testing the tool with frontline responders and survivors of trafficking, we developed Apprise. It really is just a simple tool to support frontline responders in their initial screening of workers in vulnerable settings. This initial screening often happens in the field and in front of potentially their exploiter. By using a phone, a set of headphones, and audio-based questions translated into workers' preferred languages, it overcomes the privacy and communication barriers that prevent workers from disclosing their conditions of work. Questions are aligned to ILO indicators of forced labour, so a simple calculation is undertaken based on the workers' responses to let them and the frontline responder know how vulnerable their work situation is. Many workers don't actually know that their treatment is unlawful, so this step helps them to be more aware of their rights at work. One of my favourite parts of Apprise is that these anonymous responses to interviews are collected and can be analysed to identify patterns in responses and types of exploitation. Our aim is that these patterns could be used to contribute to evidence-based policy and response. By understanding the patterns of exploitation, better prevention strategies could be developed to stop workers from being exploited in the first place. When we understand how workers are being exploited, we can refine our protection strategies, helping frontline responders to know how to detect and respond to cases. And when more workers are identified, there's a greater chance for remediation and for exploiters to be prosecuted. Since beginning in 2018, over 80,000 workers have been interviewed for indications of labour exploitation using a prize in fishing, seafood processing, sex work, domestic work, hospitality, conditions of work in global supply chains, and recruitment practices in global supply chains. We currently have questions available in 22 languages, predominantly Asian languages, but we also have support for some African, Eastern European, and South American languages. We keep on expanding this list as we work with NGOs, intergovernmental organisations, public and private labour inspectors and brands to support frontline responders to assess working conditions, investigate cases, and bring remedy to cases that are identified. Thanks for listening to this talk.
Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Angie Henderson. I'm a professor of sociology at the University of Northern Colorado, and I'm also co-founder for the Avery Center for Research and Services. We're an organization based here in the US that provides services to survivors of sex trafficking. And I want to talk to you today about my side of the organization, the research side, and how survivor stories are incredibly useful for the intelligence communities and the incredible insight that survivors can offer when they're engaged as researchers. So I first want to share with you a little bit about the Avery Center's model. So everything that we do, every step of the way, the services that we offer, the programming that we recommend, and then our collaboration with law enforcement and the intelligence community, there's a survivor at every step. And that collaboration piece is super important. We start there because not one of us in our siloed industries can address the problem of human trafficking and even begin to start to coming up with a solution unless we work together. And that includes survivors. So our organization employs survivors. We've got an on-the-job training program, and I oversee 3 survivor researchers on my team, many of whom didn't come to us out of their exploitation with any research experience. So I'm there to provide that training and to provide that support and watch them as they get engaged in the research process. And the results have been incredibly powerful. So we're very collaborative. Pictured in this photo, we were in Houston, Texas, helping the mayor's office come up with some data points and do outreach to victims on the street, and wrapping it all up into this beautiful research package that we presented at the end of our time there. You can see there's service providers in this photo. There's 2 survivors, there's myself as an academic and researcher, and then there's a law enforcement officer. So together, we were able to make a much stronger impact in our recommendations based on the data and the outreach and the conversations that we had with both victims and survivors while we were there. I've started to notice over the course of my time at the Avery Center that oftentimes research becomes me search. So among my staff that I work with at the Avery Center, I'm noticing that once you engage people in figuring out what happened to them and why it happened, a really powerful and profound thing takes place. They become they start healing in a way that they probably wouldn't be able to heal in any other space because they're asking questions and getting answers. And along the way, they're finding out that they were not alone, right? And we've got a quote here from our project in Houston where this individual talks about how important it is to give back, how doing the research and just listening to people tell their stories was incredibly healing because this individual didn't have that. This individual in particular, her exploration into her healing and the things that she's experienced have absolutely blown my mind. She's always coming up with ideas and research questions for me to help her get the answers to. And then her insights are incredibly helpful to the intelligence community. And I have to say, doing this on a team of survivors is the power, the potential there is exponential, because when you have people with lived experience in a room with another person who's been in those shoes, survivors are gonna open up and there's automatic rapport that you cannot build with somebody who hasn't been there. So this individual in particular, one of my research assistants, discovered her Google map one day, and I immediately thought of the intelligence community and how incredibly valuable and amazing this aspect of her lived experience is. She was logged on and asked for her Google timeline as she was searching through her phone, and she came across this map. And if you drill all the way down, you can see the addresses where she was trafficked, the homes of sex buyers that she went to, where she ate, which banks she went to, everything. It's frightening. And so we're about to launch on a partnership with an organization actually based in the United Kingdom, Stop the Traffic, to build this out and to scale it. And I know that once we get our survivors in a room and we build that rapport, we'll be able to build and scale this project to something that hopefully is incredibly valuable to the intelligence community. The phrase goes, right, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, in this sense, a survivor's story is worth 10,000 data points. And we're super excited to see where this project takes us. Thank you so much for having me today.
Great. So it was, I think those two talks really showcased how people with lived experiences are being involved in the process of how data is potentially being used, and which is a valuable, I think, space as part of how we design, develop, and potentially deploy technologies that is used for a human right or for social good. So I now want to turn to Jennifer, Silky, and Natasha specifically around two intersecting issues. And Silky raised one of them earlier, which is around the sort of use of data that is collected sort of both passively and actively. And of course, for machine learning methods, they're dependent on data and a lot of data. So we'd like to hear a little bit more, one on, what are some of the concerns around the use of both active and passive data, whether transparency, accountability, and many of the other issues that are raised, as well as what we also find in some of our spaces is that technologies that are being developed, such as facial recognition technology, are then used in different contexts. So it's a repurposing of some of these technologies, whether that's in law enforcement, migration, humanitarian purposes. So I'm going to turn to the three of you to sort of just help to unpack and what are the things that we should be considering potentially as these both data and tools are used or redeployed. Maybe I'll start with Silky to kick us off.
Okay, sure. I mean, it's a really broad question, and I think what we've seen there in the talks is yet again examples of how this massive data collection can be both a massive benefit and also it can be a real risk. I think that we should look beyond just what there's an important question here about what opportunities and risk the technologies offer, but we must also be careful not to humanize the impact of the technology too much at this stage. It's ultimately people who are making these technologies, people who are then utilizing them, people who are legislating or not legislating, as is often the case, around them. And it's the casualness with which we're walking into this revolution, really. I mean, it really is. We are on the precipice of a totally different world with totally different standards and totally different interpretations of our rights, I think. And there is a bit too much complacency, a bit too much inaction. And so in cases where, even something that technologically is relatively unsophisticated, like downloading data from a phone, that has been the difference between, in many cases, for complainants of rape and sexual offences. That was a difference between justice and not. It was a difference between having rapists walking free and not. Because so many people, when they were faced with that demand, and often we worked with a lot of people who were in that situation. Often women were going to the police with their phones and saying, you'll see this message or that message. They wanted to provide the relevant evidence, but what they were being asked for was everything. And then when police forces realized that they had too much data, they said, we're going to start using AI to sift through it all, not realizing that the problem was that they were taking too much data, they were expecting too much data, they had no respect for the privacy of the women, and no understanding that taking a phone away from someone in that circumstance, and then the way that things were being looked at on the phones, things that were irrelevant were being used against the women. I think it's a really good example of how even they're technologically unsophisticated, but our expectations have totally changed, or society's expectations have totally changed. In that case, I think that's a success story because the law has been changed, and Big Brother Watch was instrumental in that campaign, working with a coalition of about 11 victims and women's rights groups. And there is a code of practice now that gives police much clearer guidance, and as well there's a instrumental court judgment on what can and can't be done. But it's too late for a lot of people, because there are thousands of women that never got justice, and thousands of women who were put at risk because these perpetrators weren't brought to justice. When we look at these other areas like facial recognition, biometric borders, mass surveillance, what in these circumstances will be the things that happen because we left it too late to properly legislate and properly regulate, so that these technologies can be used in ways that help people, the ways that other people on the panel can talk about more than me as the kind of, the pessimist and the person ringing the alarm bells. There are, of course, opportunities, but some of the risks are going to be so severe if policymakers and people, and police forces have responsibilities as well to make sure that when these technologies are being adopted, it's being done in a really responsible and safe way.
Great. Maybe we could hear from Natasha and then Jennifer.
Yeah, definitely. So, you heard from my colleague Hannah there, who developed one of our tools that's used. So this tool called DigiNext Surprise that we use to interview potential victims of modern slavery, who can then raise, situations that they're in by answering a set of, fairly simple questions. And I think, one of the points that she raised was around, often victims aren't kind of aware that they're in a situation of exploitation. And therefore, it's up to, the collecting that data, analysing it, and seeing where there's maybe a number of different forced labour indicators that have been identified that can actually raise that situation to say, yes, that there is a situation of forced labour or, exploitation going on here that can then be further explored. But I think to your, the points around what are potential risks of doing this, and one of the things that actually, since the tool was initially developed by Hannah around 4 or 5 years ago to help frontline responders identify cases of forced labour, it's been adapted to be able to be deployed remotely. And this was during the COVID-19 pandemic when, frontline responders, or in the case of international supply chains, auditors that were usually going into sites to kind of conduct interviews with workers on site could no longer travel and therefore could no longer conduct those kind of interviews. So we developed, adapted the technology to be able so that workers can themselves scan a QR code and still participate and take the surveys and provide feedbacks to the sort of international brands of the supply chains they're working in, and those cases could still be raised. But what there's obviously a risk there of happening is that if you've got groups of workers that are potentially the most vulnerable workers, for example, women or migrant workers who have kind of migrated from potentially sort of rural communities, people in kind of extreme poverty who are working in some of these supply chains, are often, tech illiterate, often don't have smartphones, and they're then excluded from being able to participate in the surveys, and they're often the ones that are most vulnerable. So there you need to kind of identify that actually there's a risk of using technology that's going to mean you've got your most vulnerable victims excluded from the situations, and then you're going to have a massive data gap because their voices aren't being included. So that means that you need to really understand if, you know, who are the people that you're working with? What is their tech literacy levels like? Are we going to need to work with like local partners, local NGOs to be able to make sure that there's training and support that happens alongside that? So I think it's really about sort of understanding tech can be a great, you know, there's a lot of opportunity to collect amazing amount of data. As Hannah said, the app, we've reached over 80,000 workers. That's a huge amount of data that can show sort of patterns of exploitation in certain industries in certain countries. But we do need to make sure that we're including everyone in that, and therefore you've really got to understand sort of where there might be people that you need a different approach, and technology might not always be the right solution.
Jennifer.
So I completely agree with what people have been saying about the ability of, or the potential for data and AI as well to be transformative in tackling human rights problems like modern slavery or like human trafficking or like County Line's drug trafficking. And the kind of exploitation of people that comes with all of these things. Data can be exceptionally powerful, exceptionally useful. It can give us incredible insights into what's going on, and it can help us get to the people who are responsible ultimately for these problems. But even allowing for that, I think on balance, the use of data and the related use of AI has been an absolute disaster for human rights in this country and in other countries as well. If we think of things like in labour or employment, and I don't just mean things like the gig economy kind of platforms, but algorithmic management of workers, the increasingly widespread surveillance of workers at work, very intensive monitoring, like allowing people 3 minutes to go to the bathroom and then disciplining them if they don't get back in time. That should be completely unacceptable, but it's not illegal. It's allowed. We have things like in relation to the kind of online regulation that Silky was talking about. We're essentially at a point where the government is proposing another mass surveillance infrastructure to inflict what could potentially be the single biggest infringement on freedom of expression in this country for many, many decades in the shape of the Online Safety Bill. We have the Investigatory Powers Act, which I think Silky talked about as well, which is the bulk surveillance kind of practices, which is allowed by this law. We have a wide range of things. We also have in the public sector exceptionally punishing uses of data and surveillance and AI to basically just to attack people for being poor and for needing to rely on the state for help. It's completely unacceptable that this is allowed. It's a complete disaster for human rights, but it's also by and large not just completely lawful, but in some cases we have legislation explicitly allowing this, explicitly putting in place a framework for this. It doesn't have to be this way. We can change how we use data in this country to make sure that we do things that can have the kind of impact that the others on this panel are talking about and that the people in the lightning talks talked about. At the minute, we're not heading in that direction. The government is proposing reforms to data protection law, which massively roll back the protections for people and again pose very serious problems for human rights in this country. We have governments who want to, with the Online Safety Bill, which is still working through Parliament, we have governments that want to roll back encryption of communications, as Silky was talking about. So we have potentially great benefits from the use of data, but we also have a complete catastrophe as far as human rights are concerned. We're not at risk of sliding into a tech dystopia. For many people, we're already in a tech dystopia, and I think we need to do something about that quite quickly.
Great. Well, unfortunately, Britain's uncovering more and more cases of slavery, from sex trade to car washes. And I ask the panel, are we doing enough to charge and convict perpetrators? Are we doing enough to support victims, to drive businesses to take action? Even with more detection and charges, this doesn't appear to translate into convictions. Why is this the case? What evidence or data is missing? What's needed? What role do you think data or tech could play? From your perspective, who and what is needed to support investigations, to get convictions, and to support victims? So I put this question to Parosha and to Nick.
Thank you, Allaine. I love that terminology, although, of course, hate the reality of we are in a tech dystopia. You're right. I think when it comes to actually the victims of human trafficking and modern slavery, we need to really put our finger on the pulse point of recruitment. because over the last 5 years, it's possible that recruitment online accounts for around 80% of cases. So that, you know, individual trafficker going to the individual victim and etc. In person is changing. And we're not able to really map that yet, and we're not really able to understand what that means in terms of responses to protecting victims. We still often have, and unsurprisingly, with the type of dialogue that's been arising recently in politics, a mistrust and a distrust by victims of the state. And so where partnerships and collaboration are needed, and where the feeling that you're going to be protected by the police is needed, are again pulse points that we need to kind of focus on. So coming back to recruitment, there are some legal problems that arise as well when it comes to detecting crimes. And so I'm just throwing open a few of my thoughts as to what the problems are. Having started from the perspective as an optimist, I'm back in my familiar territory of questioning really what's going on and what more needs to be done, which is kind of like, you know, where I always am as a human rights barrister, trying to hit the target, the moving targets, to see how we can change the dimension for victims. So if we accept that a lot of recruitment is going on online, how do we find the perpetrators? They're hidden behind computer screens and wires and internet, you know, operations. We've got a huge mass of movement globally from Africa, from Asia, from poorer countries into the Middle East, where they are recruited through recruitment agencies, putting their ads online or on TV, saying that, you know, come to us, we'll get you a brilliant job, you know, as a cook, a chef, a chauffeur, and they pay thousands of pounds equivalent as a recruitment fee to then only find when they're in a country where there's a much weaker rule of law and there's nothing in terms of respect for workers' rights. They are, frankly, in conditions of enslavement. And these cases are, you know, really a growing preponderance, and it's surprising nothing is done. But if we look at why is nothing done, one of the questions arises, how do we sue recruitment agencies that operate online? Where are they? In which country do they operate? How can we detect them? How can we bring down the corporations that traffic and profit from trafficking if we can't see them? And if law doesn't touch them, because one country's trafficking laws may be about its own borders and what happens inside, and a little bit about somebody being moved outside or somebody being moved in. But what about when people are moved through a third country into another, and that country where they end up isn't that interested in having a criminal accountability for the perpetration of trafficking crimes? So that's one of the big problems, extraterritorial jurisdiction as well as political will when it comes to wanting to find out what's going wrong. Stay in this tech space. What about when women and girls, and sometimes boys and men, but less prevalently, are used for webcam work? And they are, you know, exploited. They might have been in a situation where they're being threatened, or where they're in debt bondage, or where someone's just abusing their vulnerability. And, you know, we have lots of situations of what's called the lover boy phenomenon, where somebody is approached online, they make a boyfriend online, but actually that boyfriend is a trafficker. And then eventually, you know, through the relationship developing, they end up in an exploitative relationship one-on-one, which then transgresses to an exploitative relationship because the person is being sold for sexual images. And what happens if that person then has their images online and can't get them down? And so their privacy is not only being invaded again and again, but they're being abused again and again by the knowledge that other people are taking interest in those images. So how do we bring down those images? How do we make companies accountable? How do we make servers accountable for what is going on. So these are just a few things that I wanted to introduce. And ultimately, when we're looking at human rights, when there's been the perpetration of a crime, such as trafficking against an individual, and yes, they want to see a criminal justice angle to it, and criminalization, and a conviction, and some deterrent penalties. But where that's not possible, and even in cases where it is, what about the duty to have restorative remedy, to, for example, receive compensation and damages for the harm that's been suffered, particularly when somebody else has profited from literally your blood, in terms of using you as a human being for their own ends. In all of these cases, there's nil chance, because where you have nil accountability, you have nil chance of reparation. So again, it's just something that I wanted to flag up. These are the problems that I see victims facing every day.
Sobering problem, challenges for sure.
Thank you.
Nick, we're going to see a video of a project that you've been involved with. So can you just also highlight some of the challenges and maybe help set us up for the work that you've been doing?
Highlight challenges and set you up for the video, which I've recorded but haven't seen yet. I will try. So I think, first of all, and remind me to talk about reparation at the end, because I think that's a really important point. So, and I've got a good example. So I think, first of all, there is the nature of the crime, right? And this is both police and society. We're used to seeing crime in binary terms. You've got a victim and offender. Sometimes all the time when we come across this type of crime, it's not as clear cut. Sometimes if, say, the victim is a victim of labour exploitation and they've been brought into the country and they've gone to open a bank account within 2 days of coming into the country, they don't know at that stage they're a victim. They might be, as I had in one investigation, they might be a sort of 6-foot ex-Foreign Legion soldier. They don't see themselves as vulnerable. The bank staff don't see them as vulnerable. So how do we identify them as a victim? And how do we then tackle that crime, whether or not the victim supports an investigation? Because we talked about, that they will often come from a place where they don't trust the police. If that's a victim of assault, then that's fine. If you've been punched in the street and you say, look, I don't trust the police, I don't want you to investigate this crime, that's it, that's where it ends. But this is far more complex than that. So first of all, we need to understand this as a network-based, organised crime. And I would argue, and please correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I would argue there's 3 main commodities that organised criminals use: guns, drugs, and people. And with people, it's specifically the exploitation of people. Wherever you see a hierarchy of organised crime, whether it's a Vietnamese cannabis grower at the bottom of it, where it's somebody who's being exploited for sexual services, whether it's a victim of labour exploitation, there's always a hierarchy where the person at the bottom is taking all of the risks with the least reward, and there's people at the top taking all the reward and taking less risk. Often we see just a binary relationship between victim and offender. We try to safeguard the victim, we try to tackle the offender, but if the victim doesn't give us evidence, we often, not in all cases, and you raised a brilliant case where it didn't happen, but we often then leave it there. We don't explore the full network. So some of the stuff I talked about earlier on is stuff which will help us explore the network and help us understand that hierarchy to tackle the organised crime that sits behind it, whether or not the victim is supporting the investigation. And I simply don't think we do that enough because we don't understand that relationship between the victim and offender. We don't understand why, in the same way as in the 1980s, we wouldn't have understood why a victim of domestic violence didn't just walk away from the relationship. We don't understand often why that victim doesn't walk away from the exploitative relationship they're in. So we need to get much better at that. We need to have the resources to do it. So therefore, when we're analysing this stuff, when we're looking at all the data around organised crime, we need to be able to compare like with like. So what is the damage being caused by an organised crime group or OCG that is exploiting people versus one that is bringing multiple kilos of Class A drugs into the country? And I'd suggest that they're overlapping, aren't they? Because the drugs come into the country and at the bottom end there's people being exploited. But we need to tackle it all systemically, and we can't do that unless we've got the data to tackle it. Then there's the issue of crime pays. So people do this to make money. I'm teeing it up now because it's all about financial data, isn't it? I'm doing well here. People do this to make money. There's no other reason they do it. They don't do it for the kicks. They do it to make money. And they can make a huge amount of money doing it. And like I say, the people at the top of a hierarchy are taking very little risk because the chances of getting convicted for this stuff is really small. So they're taking little risk and it pays for them to do it. And the money that they're making, the money that is flowing through financial institutions is visible. If only we could analyse it, and if only we could see it. If only we had the laws available to easily recover that money as well. Because I think I'm right in saying that globally we identify 1% of the funds that are made by organised crime groups. And my real frustration here is that we should be investing a huge amount of money in getting this money back. This is money that is going out of the legitimate economy and is being cashed and is going nowhere. It's not being paid into local economies. You know, we're talking about working in deprived areas and not spending money. It's all being shipped elsewhere. And obviously there's the misery of the people involved. We should be getting all this money back. We should be investing £1 million in a team that then gets us £10 million back. We should then be investing that £10 million in more teams to get it back. And because then obviously the victims get their money back. So I had a modern slavery investigation that's still going on that started in 2015. We identified over £2 million that have been moved through a number of different bank accounts, which you'll see in the video in a short while. If I could tell you that until recently, we'd identified £70,000 of assets that OCG had. That's increased now only because we've got a couple of British people that we managed to charge and convict, people who, one of whom was running a recruitment agency, you know, a legitimate recruitment agency. I think we've identified £120,000 from him. So we've identified out of £2 million, we've identified a couple of 100,000, and we still haven't recovered that, and none of that's gone to the victims yet. We do have a civil case. The good news is we've got a civil case going on where 11 out of the 400 victims are suing the recruitment agencies to get some reparation for the work they did. But they did that work sort of 8 or 9 years ago, and they still haven't got any pay for it. So as long as crime pays, and as long as we can't get that money back and give them to our victims, this stuff will continue.
Okay. Great. So let's just watch our the last two tech talks, which again give us illustration of approaches to tackling some of these problems using technology, and then we'll come back to the panel and just ask for a minute each to make any final comments.
Hello, my name's Nick Dale. I'm here to talk to you about Project Castellum, which is a collaboration between Accenture and West Midlands Police and the Alan Turing Institute to look at the use of AI and data sharing to target modern slavery. Project Castellum was born out of originally Operation Fort, which was an investigation that I picked up in 2015. In total, we had 400 victims. We've convicted 12 people with a total of 70 years plus in custody. They laundered the money from their victims through 12 banks with over 250 bank accounts, and we gathered tens of thousands of lines of bank transaction evidence during the course of the investigation. Over £2 million was laundered by the organised crime group in total. What we were able to do through the course of the investigation was identify investigative insights which led us to form a better understanding of this crime type. So here you've got, for example, one individual who would go into the bank to open bank accounts with a number of victims. There were other insights such as the lifestyle of a bank account that we were able to identify. On the right there, you see a product from a project I was involved in a couple of years after picking up the investigation, which was a National Data Analytics Solution, or NDAS. We were able to identify insights from West Midlands Police data, apply artificial intelligence models to identify the individuals who are involved in modern slavery from the sort of millions of pieces of police data that we have. And obviously you can see there a really dense network, which was the Operation Fort network. These sort of insights led us to Project Castellum, which is the collaboration between Accenture, and you've got Luke on the team there, Alan Turing with Anjali, and myself from West Midlands Police. What we were able to do is identify certain insights from the investigation. So we were able to look at how a victim's bank account presented itself, for example, and we were able to do things like the network you see on the screen there, which is a merging of the police and the financial data that we were able to put together during a hackathon last year. Obviously, the data ecosystem for modern slavery is really complicated. This is some work Alan Turing did to look at what data is shared where, and really ask the question of how do we enable the privacy, the security and the trust in sharing that data. And obviously Castellum is looking at police and financial data, but the future of this is potentially more data sharing to be identified. So what are the next steps of Project Castellum? Well, first of all, we're looking for more stakeholders to engage in some more cross-sector work. So people to provide data for us, people to advise us on the best way forward. I think we're really clear about where we want to take this, which is the next step is working in a sandbox to further develop insights from the financial and the police data. What we don't have is that large amounts of financial data that we can look for that modern slavery needle in the data haystack with. So we're really keen to progress that, develop network analytics, supervised machine learning models within that data, exploring the use, of course, of privacy enhancing technologies to protect the data subjects as we do this. And develop those insights, but develop them safely, and looking towards drafting something that looks like a white paper or a blueprint to look at what the policies and procedures might be to do this going forward. Now, this is a real whistle-stop tour because I was only given 5 minutes. I could talk about this all day. If this was to work, what we would look to do is influence the policy, identify potentially other data sets, look at what a sustainable infrastructure would be for this data, what I call the plumbing before the poetry, to really drive this forward, enable public-private data sharing and the analysis of that data, and to drive better insights for all, for societies, for victims, for law enforcement to target offenders, but for others to identify and safeguard victims and to really tackle those networks. So that is, like I say, a really whistle-stop tour. If you want to get involved in Project Castellum, the email is there. The email address project.castellum@turing.uk. Thank you for listening.
It's Darren Edge. I'm a director in human rights technology at Microsoft Research Special Projects, and today I'll be talking about safe data sharing in the fight against human trafficking. So for me, this work began back in 2018 when Microsoft helped to co-found Tech Against Trafficking, or TAT. This is a coalition of technology organizations working together to combat trafficking with technology. One of the primary interventions of TAT is the accelerator program that aims to advance and scale the use of technology by frontline anti-trafficking organizations. In 2019, the organization we worked with was IOM, the UN Migration Agency, and they came to us with this problem with their CTDC data hub. This is a data hub that collates data from IOM, Polaris, Liberty Shared, and others to create the world's largest database on identified victims of trafficking. The idea of the data hub is to release that data to support evidence-based policy and decision-making, but there's some problems with this anonymization method used to create the data release. It was causing a loss of data, almost 40% of the input data, and it was having some residual privacy risks. And so we worked to address these problems with a new approach to private data release we call synthetic data showcase. And IOM used this to create the first ever data set on all identified victims of trafficking with what we call full anonymity, so much stronger privacy protection than they had with the previous release. We continued this work to develop a new technology called PackSynth. This adds what we call differential privacy to synthetic data showcase. This is a much stronger privacy guarantee that works even across multiple releases. And at the same time, we released a web application for STS, which we believe is the first public utility for private data release. And so IOM used both of these technologies to create, again, their first ever data sets that have differential privacy, as well as that describe the relationships between victims and perpetrators. And this is really important information for the community. So here's an example data showcase. You can see it has 3 parts. On the left, it has data attributes describing the characteristics of victims. In the center, you can see data attributes describing the characteristics of perpetrators. On the right-hand side, you can see a comparison between the light blue bars, which are counts derived from synthetic data, and dark blue bars, which are aggregate counts that are pre-computed for all short combinations of attributes. So these are, the kinds of things that you might want to report or reference. It's important they're as accurate as possible so as not to mislead downstream decision making. And so as we interact with the dashboard, you'll see a few things. You'll see that at the outset, the synthetic attribute counts perfectly match the aggregate attribute counts. And as we select attributes to compose a query, in this case, gender female for victim characteristics, you can see that the synthetic data closely tracks the distribution of counts observed in the aggregate data set. And this is true kind of whichever way we look at the data. Here we're looking at male victims. Now we're looking at female victims again, exploited by males in this instance, and females in this instance. All the time, those distributions on the right-hand side that you can see, the comparison between the light blue bars and the dark blue bars is very close. And that means the synthetic data is accurately capturing the structure and statistics of the sensitive data that we're seeking to protect. Now, as we continue adding to our query, we tend to narrow down to smaller and smaller subsets of data until we get to a point where we run out of these pre-computed aggregates. And so we see that when those dark blue bars disappear. And at this point, we're left to rely on the synthetic data itself. The aggregate data doesn't have information on all these lower level combinations. So here's an example of the data synthesis process using our public web application. I'm just going to synthesize a data set using differential privacy now. So I've selected the method. I'm going to choose the privacy parameter that gives the level of privacy. I'm going to execute this, and the data synthesis happens directly in the memory of the web browser. So no data gets transmitted to any servers. That synthesis process is completed. I can see an evaluation summary. I can see some advanced evaluation statistics and charts. And I can see the synthetic data itself and download that data along with the aggregate data and the interface in Power BI that you saw previously. And there are privacy preserving data artifacts ready for use. Now, of course, safe data sharing isn't just for counter-human trafficking, it's for all human rights work. So for more resources and links to data sets and tools, please visit aka.ms/human rights technology or contact me at darren.edge@microsoft.com. Thank you.
Great. The last two talks highlight some of the work that obviously we've been involved in around the importance of sort of responsible data sharing and the role that potentially privacy enhancing technologies can play, but also recognizing that before we just jump to a technical intervention, we need to consider some of the other both social and legal and cultural issues that might play a role, which Nick highlighted our work from the ecosystem landscaping that we did. So we're now near the end, basically at the end of our time. So we're going to do a quick wrap up and ask each of the panelists to just share their final reflections, just taking a minute each, hearing what they've heard, both from each other and from the talks. So I might start with Nick this time. And
okay, so
modern
slavery human trafficking, I think there's three key things about it. First of all, it is exceptionally widespread. Secondly, it's hidden crime. It's so hidden that sometimes we don't see it when it's right in front of us, and sometimes victims don't know they're victimised. And sometimes even when we do see it, we can't or won't do anything with it. And thirdly, it is one of the key organised crime types that is affecting this country. When you think about data, we collect a huge amounts of data, and current technologies allow us to do some really interesting stuff with it to identify insights that help us tackle that crime type. Because we can do this stuff, then I would argue that we should push the boundaries of what is possible to do within the legal and ethical framework of what we can do. And finally, and one thing I didn't mention earlier on is it should only ever enhance our understanding. There's so many other our professional judgment, what our partners are telling us. There's so many other things that we should bear in mind. But because we can do this stuff, then we should.
Thank you, Natasha.
Yeah, well, picking up on, I was glad that a couple of people mentioned the sort of issue around recruitment, because I think that is such a key issue in forced labour, and we know that one of the key kind of points when, especially migrant workers, are, initially sort of trapped in that, situation, whether it's debt bondage, is through their initial recruitment. And I think this is something that we are working incredibly hard with the private sector, is to be able to connect, companies operating often sort of large multinational corporations with the recruitment agencies that are actually recruiting workers back in the country of origin of those migrant workers. And this is really beginning to shine a light on who those actors are, and at least be able to bring visibility to who are the recruitment actors that are recruiting the workers that are then being placed in the supply chains of my products. And I think this is, one of the first times that we're actually seeing those connections being made, and it's a great, that is something that technology and can shine a light on that data, to just be able to know who are those recruitment actors. And then you can begin to sort of triangulate that data, as I mentioned, what we're trying to do. Often the suppliers that workers end up in that facility, working, whether it's a farm or whether it's a factory, it's not actually, they're not being exploited by their employer, they're being exploited by the recruitment agency that's placed them there. And by triangulating the different data points of the feedback that the workers are giving us, the feedback that the recruitment agencies are giving us, and the feedback that the employers are giving us, we can begin to identify inconsistencies in that data. And that's really interesting, and that's beginning to, show us really, flag up situations that before we just couldn't identify. And I think there's a great opportunity to share data, amongst more actors and amongst, we're working with private sector actors, but there's certainly others that we could share that data with on the kind of situations and trends and things that we're finding.
Great. Silky.
Well, I think we've all heard a really good mix of the opportunities and the risks that are involved in this space. I suppose I want to contextualize that in the kind of reality of where we are right now, which is, as I said, on a precipice of a very different world. But also, we're having this conversation and about policing and data after an excoriating report was published yesterday. And so, for example, what we saw yesterday in the Met review is that even rape kits couldn't be stored properly. Now we're talking about police storing masses and masses of data. Let's just hold our horses and make sure that this is being done in a safe and responsible way, so that potential disasters are averted, because as we've explored, those potential disasters are absolutely there. This has to be done in a very careful and safe way. I will push back a little bit on Nick and say, just because we can does not mean that we should. And we really need a broader look at this. Of course, from a policing perspective, I'd be terrible. If I were in your shoes, I'd want to have probably a surveillance society, because, when you're looking at things from that perspective, of course, that's the drive that you have. And I think police forces have been left adrift politically because there has been no political drive to regulate in this space. So it is police officers and police forces who are talking about influencing policy, but not the broader range of voices that you need when you're doing policy making. So, with respect, we shouldn't have police-driven policy because it's too narrow. We need to have a really broad look at all of the issues that are engaged with this data accumulation and with new technologies when we do it. Because otherwise, talk about pushing boundaries makes me a bit nervous. Because I'm worried that we might trip over into slightly dangerous territory. And also, from a law enforcement perspective, if you don't have that safe approach, there won't be the longevity. So you need to bake in safeguards, regulations, and importantly, human rights into any technological developments at a very early stage. Otherwise, there will be an implosion later. There you go. I finished with the word implosion. So, reflection of my pessimism, sorry.
Thank you, Silky. Parosha.
Thank you. I think just coming back to we've been talking a lot about, modern slavery, human trafficking, just want to remind myself that we're talking about human beings. And human beings used to be all powerful, and now they're all vulnerable in a world of tech when it comes to trafficking and modern slavery. And so I think that we need to find ways to empower victims through tech so that it's not just doing them harm in the way that we can see, and it's only in the one-off case that they are protected by it. So how would it be possible, for example, to have some reporting scheme that is developed through tech that would enable victims across the world, wherever they are, what form of exploitation that they're receiving, to be able to obtain or to be able to identify themselves as being victims, and to try to secure support and protection. You know, that's going to take a global world that wants to protect. It's not going to take individuals, and it's not going to take chat. But there is leadership around the world, and I think that if we can design policies and we can propose laws and we can have the intelligence that is shared amongst those experts here who know what they're talking about in terms of tech far more than me, then there's a real hope and a future, because unless we care, we can't protect. And if we don't protect, then tech is going to become bigger than the human. And once that happens, like many people have said, it's an unstoppable force. And only those who profit will ever walk away feeling safe.
Wow, that's I'm like, Jennifer, I'm hoping maybe you can help to tie this up, but also the role that law can play in safeguarding.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what we've heard today is extremely positive. I think it's fantastic, some of the ways that data is being used to address things like human trafficking or modern slavery. Data is potentially transformative, which is a thing that a lot of people say, but it can only be that if it's with the right safeguards, if it's with the right legal, governance, institutional mechanisms to make sure that we don't inadvertently cause more human rights problems in the pursuit of solving the ones that we have already. I think all of us probably agree that we want to see an end to modern slavery. I think we would all want to see an end to human trafficking. We would all love to see tech and data being a very positive force for change and for protecting people and helping survivors and victims of these things. And to do that, we do need legal reform. We do need new laws that can put in place mechanisms to make sure that people's data can be used in responsible ways, but also can't, for example, be shared with the border force, and then they end up getting deported off to Rwanda. We also have to think, though, about these other kind of issues that I mentioned before, and we need to think about the ways that law helps cause those problems. But these things aren't in tension. We can have data used in ways that's beneficial and helps tackle things like modern slavery and human trafficking, and we can have laws that prevent the kind of problems that we had before. We can do both of those things. Law is capable of doing both of those things. What we need is political will, and what we need is to want it enough to make it happen.
Thank you. I think that was a powerful end to this session, and I just want to thank all of our panelists for being here and sharing their perspectives. And also, I hope that what you've come away with is just an encouragement to view and to consider the diverse perspectives that are involved and needed, and also that law and tech are not just, the enabler, the detractor, or the inhibitor, and just the sort of polarized, but really the considerations that we need to make and to balance for a more responsible and safe approach. So with that, I'm going to end our session. Thank you.
Much, and let's thank our panel for an excellent